Week's topic is cryptozoology and cryptids. Right? And these are semi-mythical animals or hidden animals or things that are hard to find or things that it hasn't been proven yet whether they exist or not. As we're going to see, most of them are based on, well, a couple of things. The taking of myth too seriously, the distortion of findings, and we're going to look at a number of them in this lecture. But first I wanted to point out a website I posted a link to on Blackboard. I found this. I thought it was kind of neat. Most famous mythical creature in every state. So it has the Dogman in Michigan, a number of other creatures, Chupacabra, we're going to talk about, Menehune in Hawaii. So if you were interested to see, okay, what are the, or here you can see this is the lake monster. We're also going to talk about lake monsters. This is in Lake Champlain. I think it's just called Champ. The number of different lake creatures you can see over here. So if you go on the website, you can find alphabetical order by state, all the different creatures, really nice artwork. So definitely check it out. Some of the readings you're doing this week are related to topics we already discussed. That was giants, and in some ways giants are a cryptid. And some of the distortion, some of the misinterpretations surrounding giants is also true of some of these somewhat human creatures or part human creatures or strange crypto animals. Right? So Adrienne Meyer in her book, you're going to see, feels that some mythical creatures in ancient societies were based on the misinterpretation of fossils that they came across. She believes that the griffin was an amalgamation of a pterosaur, kind of like a triceratops, but it's more of like a protoceratops. Instead of having the three horns, it has that large bony ridge there. And so seeing a protoceratops skull, you could see how someone could interpret it as an eagle, a very large eagle kind of skull. Of course, this thing would be enormous, and so they would kind of extrapolate from there and say, oh, this must have been some sort of incredible sized creature, which it was. It just wasn't a griffin. Cryptozoologification, right, is sort of the use of fuzzy abstractions, using myth, supernatural conceptions, weird events, first-person eyewitness testimony, scientification of folklore goes into all of this, right? So cryptozoology is kind of a pseudoscience mixed with folklore studies mixed with all sorts of other things, as we're going to see. And one of the most common traditions found throughout the world are lake monsters. It's only up until recent days, the bodies of water were pretty mysterious. There's some diving in the 1700s. That was very limited. 1800s, you had an expansion of that, and then finally with the development of submarines and also with the aqualung, scuba, self-contained underwater breathing apparatus. This is when water and the environment and the creatures in water started to open up more and more, and there was more and more research done on it. But until that time, it obviously was a pretty mysterious place, lakes, bogs, oceans, and so that is ripe for misinterpretation, for myths, for folklore, for all sorts of things. So you have many different people who maybe saw something they couldn't identify, and then that got expanded into all sorts of myth, right? For example, and I don't have a good picture here, but some people believe that mermaid sightings were actually the sightings of manatees, or some other creature that the sailor didn't get a good look at, and then kind of let his imagination run away with him. So, do these stories translate to real animals? In some cases, yes, as we'll see. That is, there was an animal that was really not known and kind of seen occasionally, and then later on was identified. A lot of times, they're not, right? So it's not a known animal. It's an animal that maybe is seen or some other things are seen and then is distorted. So each of these cryptids you kind of have to examine on a case-by-case basis and see what exactly is going on. A lot of times, as we'll see, skeptics, I'll put myself in this category. They are sightings that are misinterpreted, right? Logs, animals, or other things. We'll see how your eyes can play tricks on you. So lake creatures and dragons, kind of related. So, and serpents in general, right? Snakes are found all over the world, and so you could see how people would create beings based on snakes or sea serpents or snakes that swim. Snakes can go in the water. Many snakes can go in the water and on land, right? So a Scandinavian version of this is the lindorm, right, which is a little bit related to the Midgard, which is the world serpent that's at the base of the world tree, right? And this is the one that will play an important role in the end of the world. We think that maybe the Vikings spread some of these myths to new areas. That's a possibility. Right? So you'll see these kind of lindorms or giant lake creatures depicted on maps from the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Sort of attacking ships and whatnot. If a ship strikes a reef and starts to sink, it's an underwater reef. Maybe they don't see it. Maybe some people would think, it was a creature hit us, or something like that. These kind of early cryptozoologists described mythical animals in different sources, right? And some people treated them as real sightings and real animals. Many different lakes have their own creatures that have now morphed into sort of stereotypical lake monsters. Sometimes these stories were meant to be mythical and meant to be symbolic, and now they're sort of now misinterpreted as sort of real beliefs by ancient people. So a lot of it is really based more on culture than any sort of physical evidence. It's more like a cultural conception of these different lakes. So there are a couple of people who went after evidence of the lindorm, and they, a lot of what they found was just people telling stories. Maybe not, some stories were not so good. But no physical evidence, of course. Yeah. And it's, in some ways, it's more interesting to look at the origins of the stories and what role they play in the culture than to actually try and get evidence of the creature itself, which you're not going to be able to do, most likely. So you can actually learn more about the culture by seeing the similarities and differences between the different cultures in terms of what role the creatures play, what they might be based on culturally, the function of the creature, maybe in terms of the culture. There are several sort of repeating tropes you see in many of these stories, right? So monsters go from water to water, from different bodies of water through underground caverns. Accidents are blamed on some of these lake creatures. The lakes supposedly go on and on forever. Another one that we're going to see this several instances is that they actually are prehistoric creatures. They're actually dinosaurs that survived in small numbers up until the present day. And it kind of makes it sound sciencey and more plausible because we know dinosaurs did exist. So it's one thing to say that something completely mythological like a dragon, which is no evidence of existing in the past or today, ever existed. And it's something different to say, yes, creatures that we have evidence that did exist in the past are still around today, and that's actually what is being found. The likelihood of this happening is, more than extremely rare, more than remote, that you would have a group of surviving dinosaurs are able to reproduce and replicate without anyone noticing them, and they're able to do that sort of in a closed environment like a lake or even an ocean, is more than doubtful, right? It's not possible. But this is a very popular one with lake creatures, and as we're going to see, with also pterosaurs, so flying dinosaurs. And so skeptics have kind of lumped it into, created a taxonomy and put it in the category of prehistoric survivor paradigm, or PSP, right? So we're going to look at the Loch Ness Monster, but some interpretations of the story are that it's actually a pliosaur. It's one of these water dinosaurs that survived from the ancient world. This has a lot to do with the science fiction of the late 1800s, early 1900s, with precisely this sort of genre of literature called Lost World, which is named after the famous stories by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle called The Lost World, with Professor, now I'm forgetting his name, Professor Challenger. Yeah, Professor Challenger and this expedition, I think it's in South America or Africa, but he and the explorers come upon an area that was separate from the rest of the world, that was a little bit isolated, where dinosaurs and prehistoric cavemen actually survived until the present day. And this is something, obviously you see in movies like The Lost World, you see it in TV shows like Land of the Lost. But it inspired a whole genre of literature and movies and television, that there's, the world that time forgot. There's a world out there where dinosaurs still exist. And so some people think that this is what's going on with some of these cryptids. And as we're going to see, some of the people who propose these ideas are doing so because of a specific agenda. Some of the people are creationists, and they want dinosaurs to be found today because they think that will help poke a hole in evolutionary theory, right? So it's not all sort of benign. Okay, so Central Africa is usually thought of as a lost world because to white Europeans it seemed like a lost world. They didn't know much about it, but Africans knew obviously a lot about it, and it was not isolated. It was connected through trade with other parts of Africa. And so the idea that Central Africa is sort of an untouched area and isolated from other parts of Africa and from the world is a complete myth, right? There are few places that are completely isolated. There are sometimes only islands, which are very, very remote, like Rapa Nui or Easter Island. And so one legend that is found supposedly in the Congo is Mokele Mamembe, which is this sort of half elephant, half dragon monster. It seems like with a lot of these cryptids in other areas outside of Europe, local people, once they got a sense that these white explorers or white scientists or whatnot were looking for certain things, they kind of played into that, and they gave people sort of information that they thought that they wanted. And if they were shown a picture of a dinosaur, they might say, oh yeah, that's it looks a lot like that. Right? So you can see the Carl Hagenbeck. From what I heard, the animal, of course he never saw it. This is all just, stories that the locals are telling him. What I heard, the animal, it seems to me it can only be some kind of dinosaur, seemingly akin to the Brontosaurus. As the stories come from so many different sources and all tend to substantiate each other, I'm almost convinced that some such reptile must still be in existence. At great expense, therefore, I sent out an expedition to find the monster, but unfortunately they were compelled to return home without having proved anything, either one way or the other. Notwithstanding this failure, I have not relinquished the hope of being able to present science with indisputable evidence of the existence of the monster. So with all these cryptids, and it's really the fact that they're so hard to find that in some ways makes them more intriguing for people. It's like it's almost like a quest, a difficult quest. No one has ever found it before, and there's a good reason why no one has ever found it before. It's because it doesn't exist. But all of the supposed evidence, the stories, the footprints, trace pieces of body parts, as we'll see with all these cryptids, can be debunked or shown to have another origin. Right? So with all the cryptids, except for a few that turned out to be real creatures, like the Kraken, probably most likely based on a giant squid, as we'll see, for all of these, there is no evidence. No evidence has been found, except for very, very scant evidence, you might say in quotation marks, of stories and misinterpretations of sightings. Right? So these kind of dinosaur lore stories appear in different parts of Africa. Probably they were elephants that were seen off in the distance. There's some that are described as looking like a stegosaur. Right? But most likely these are sort of elephants that might, where they couldn't see the whole thing and they might misinterpret what is actually going on. As we'll see, experts in an area like ornithology or some of these other zoological areas never identify cryptids because they don't misidentify what they see. They're experts and they know exactly what they're seeing. It's usually people who are not exactly experts in the field who might see something and then not be able to identify it and then sort of extrapolate from there. Right? So many people say it's impossible also that these dinosaurs are going to live up until the present day, and for some reason their fossils disappear at a certain point, and we don't find any fossils from that point onwards, and yet they still exist somewhere today. Right? A lot of them, as I said, a lot of people who believe these, and we're going to look at one specific case, believe that this helps debunk evolution. Right? All right, here's a cryptid that turned out to be real. It's not really cryptid, though. The okapi, right? At first was a creature that was described to people. People weren't sure if it really existed based on its description, and then it was found. So we now actually know what kind of animal it is. Right? A lot of these dinosaur hunter expeditions usually kind of work in the same way. They try to raise a lot of money. They generate a lot of interest. They're going to look for this dinosaur based on these stories. Maybe they end up doing it. They don't find anything. They make some excuse as to why they didn't find anything, and it's not resolved. A lot of it, again, is local people having fun with tourists. Right? They see kind of what people want to hear, and they give it to them basically. Yeah, log monsters. Right? These things like manatees, things like large fish can look like logs to some people, right? Look like a black trunk, and then when it's touched, it suddenly comes to life, and so you could see how people would say, oh, this log suddenly jumped to life. What's actually maybe something like a sturgeon or an oarfish. This is an oarfish you see in the Pacific Northwest. It's very dark. If it was, obviously in the lake, it'd be shiny and wet looking. Maybe it would just be resting on the surface and then suddenly appear to come to life. The Kraken, is a myth that centuries old, supposedly attacked ships, most likely based on giant squid, which are very hard to spot because they usually live in the deepest parts of the ocean. Only rarely are they seen by people. And so that was one of the reasons why maybe this Kraken myth persisted. Even today, scientists trying to study giant squid, have some difficulty because they usually reside in the deepest parts of the ocean. Right? There's a interesting website called Monster Talk, presented by Skeptic Magazine, which you might like, which has a lot of information on all these different kinds of creatures. Yeah, the Loch Ness Monster. As we're going to see with Chupacabra and the Loch Ness Monster and some of these other creatures, they're not centuries old. They're not based on ancient lore or myth. They're actually pretty recent, and then a sort of a history is given to them after the fact. So Loch Ness Monster, there's no medieval lore about any creature living in the loch. It started in 1933. And an Edinburgh newspaper even asked at the time, why have we heard of it only within the last 5 years or so when there's no authenticated record of its existence in the centuries which have gone before? That's a good question. Well, what is it based on? Some people think it could be based on submarine tests that were done in the loch, maybe prior to World War II and then maybe after World War II, right? So, some people think that maybe the periscope coming out from the test of the submarine that they were doing might have led to some of these, Nessie sightings. Other people think that rocks or fish or other kinds of things coming up the lake, and here you could see if you saw sort of like a pod of whales, or if you saw some sort of fish like this spread out, but if you were looking at them from the shore, it would look like one undulating sort of serpent-like creature. So that's how our eyes could kind of play tricks with us. All the pictures of all of these cryptids are almost always fuzzy, where you really can't tell what you're looking at. Just dark shapes. Right, could be anything. Right, you could see here from here, you see exactly where these things are located, and here's where it would be. And this, and you could see this person stay in the shallow water. Well, this obviously couldn't be very big, if the water is so shallow right up until here. Right, we're talking about something that's pretty shallow right here. So, one interesting sort of side note, there's a really good movie about Sherlock Holmes, if you like Sherlock Holmes, called The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes from the 1970s. And in the movie, I don't want to spoil it, but I think I'm going to have to. In the movie, Sherlock Holmes is investigating the sightings of the Loch Ness Monster. And it turns out that it is actually a submarine. Well, you can actually see it on the poster here. A submarine that the British were trying to test in the 1800s, or early 1900s, to use against Germany if a war broke out. And to scare away local people from the testing of the submarine, they added this head onto it so that people would be scared and frightened and run away and not try to investigate the submarine. So it was kind of a neat little movie. But yeah, every so often there's some sort of sighting, and then it's shown to be something natural, a rock, or who knows, right? And this, speaking of submarines, you could almost put this into cryptozoology, but it's sort of like fake archaeology. Shipwrecks that supposedly sank that never really sank in that area, right? So there are stories that are true about German U-boats sinking off the coast of North America. So one German U-boat was found off the coast of New Jersey. What about inland? Well, this is actually false. There was a German submarine in Lake Michigan, and that German submarine is actually now in the Museum of Science and Technology in Chicago. But that was a submarine that was captured after World War I, brought to Chicago, put into Lake Michigan for armaments testing. They basically shot it and sank it as a test. Then they later brought it up again and put it in the museum. right? But no Nazi submarines have ever been found in the Great Lakes that sort of made their way during the war down the St. Lawrence Seaway and into the lakes, right? So a lot of this, like the Lake Megantic German U-boat, was sort of made up by a team of divers. The more and more these stories get passed around, the more people start to believe them. This is, I guess, instead of a fish story, this is a submarine story, right? But you know, the whole the joke behind fish stories, of course, is that you know, as people report the story, the fish gets bigger and bigger and bigger, right? The one that got away, et cetera, et cetera. Right? So we see a lot of these kind of lake monster stories in many different cultures, and in Northwest Coast, they're not necessarily considered to be physical beings as much as mysteries of the water, sort of embodiments of that concept. So it may not actually be a real animal, but sort of a spirit. To sort of understand how these things can get misinterpreted, I've got kind of a funny video. This is one that made the internet a few years ago. These two guys from Boston, from like South Boston, out fishing, encounter a sunfish, which you can see here. Not many people see sunfish. I've never seen a sunfish for real. You can see they're pretty weird looking fish, right? Very little, not much of a tail fin, and very strange face. Well, these guys have never seen a sunfish before. They're out fishing, they encounter one, and you could see maybe how some of these cryptid stories get started based on that. Because they took a video, people easily pointed out in the comment section of their video that it was a sunfish. So nothing got past more than that. But I'll give you a warning, the video does have a lot of cursing in it, but I think you might find it entertaining. And then some clever person took the soundtrack or some of the speech from that video and overlaid it on a trailer for In the Heart of the Sea, which is a movie about a whale ship from the 1800s. I found it kind of entertaining, so I put it on our YouTube playlist as well. And then check out the presentation by Madeline this week on the Yeti. I'll have a couple comments on the Yeti after that presentation, and we'll continue finishing up with cryptids.